And this is a little bit different presentation than I normally do because obviously you told me I only had about 15 to 20 minutes. And I just wanted to do a synthesis of sort of some new projects that I'm working on climate-induced disasters and its impacts to migrants, in particular undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. And we were talking a little bit earlier about the need to have an explicit focus and separating and not speaking about disasters in that abstract terms of population groups such as Latinos and Indigenous migrants from Latin America, as well as really understanding that immigration status has a big key role to play in disparate disaster outcomes. So I just want to start off really quickly with this overview. Some of you may be familiar with my research, my initial research on my book, Climate Change from the Streets, and really want to hone in on this idea that moving away from abstract notions of environmental decline, climate change impacts that do not include the human-centered approaches. Primarily, and decades ago, it was this non-human approach, not a human-centered approach. And you know, this picture here, the polar bear, may be a tired one now, but this is from 2010, which is almost 13 years ago. And this conflict between having this strong global abstract idea of climate change impacts and human-centered approaches was very contentious. We can see this from this community flyer from environmental justice groups in West Oakland, California, and Northern California, primarily African-American and Latino and Asian populations along one of the busiest ports in California, the Port of Oakland. And here they're trying to decenter the non-human approach to human-centered approaches. And as you can see from the flyer, it reads, it's not just about polar bears. Climate justice is also about youth and the future of Oakland. So here really trying to understand that climate change happens in our streets, in our neighborhoods, and in our own backyards, and is not occurring somewhere out there in the wilderness with just polar bears and melting ice caps. So again, this is from 13 years ago, very contentious images and symbols and fights around climate policy and science. And you'll notice the word you or youth. The word youth there is emphasized with you, like sort of the individual, again, that human-centered approach. And then one of my environmental justice individuals that I interviewed told me the following. Up until the last decade, climate change tended to be a white affluent issue about saving the rainforest and polar bears. So it hadn't had deep relevance for people trying every day to get by in urban centers. Most of the messages of climate change are about eliminating global greenhouse gas emissions and not about people. And this eventually led, to my book that was published a few years ago, Climate Change from the Streets, How Conflict, Collaboration Strengthen the Environmental Justice Movement, really showing the fights and the successes and eventual multi-stakeholder collaborations that environmental justice groups, low-income communities of color, and California have done to lead the global climate justice movement, both within California and nationally. Many of the victories that I highlight here in California are the foundational texts or examples for Justice 40 initiative that the Biden administration has pushed forward in Washington, D.C. Many of those initial ideas, experiments around climate change mitigation and multi-benefit policies, co-benefits, was done in California in the streets of Oakland as well. But now my research has really shifted to looking away from this prospective climate policy making around mitigation reduction to the immediate effects of climate impacts such as heat waves, extreme heat, drought, extreme storms, and how these are disproportionately affecting low-income communities of color, in this case, Latino and Indigenous migrants, and how these communities are trying to adapt and change their environments, both from a physical perspective and most importantly, from a social economic perspective. So in California, we just experienced one of the hottest summers in California's history. But what did we really learn? A key reflection from this past summer is that we witnessed throughout the state of California that not everyone equally experiences the burden of climate change. The people who are already the most socially vulnerable in society will experience the greatest impacts of climate change. And these impacts will be more frequent and severe. They will many of these individuals, such as Latino and Indigenous migrants, will endure higher levels of air and water pollution and more intense wildfires, heat waves, and other environmental and weather hazards. Yet, when we talk about heat waves and climate change impacts, it is often articulated in abstract terms, without the basis or human-centered approaches to understanding disparate impacts and the root causes of systemic injustices. In places like California, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. In the last several years, millions of people have been affected by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, flooding, storm surges, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. In essence, wildfires and heat waves in California are not isolated disasters. They often now combine with other hazards and comorbidities, or what is called in the field of public health, a syndemic. So now more than ever, it is crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of heat waves and wildfire impacts on low-income Latino and Indigenous migrants. These populations are already experiencing an undue burden of marginalization, disenfranchisement, and discrimination in their everyday lives before a disaster strikes. These communities are already underserved and the least prepared to recover from the most severe harms caused by the climate crisis. In essence, they experience a form of hyper-marginalization when a disaster like a heat wave or wildfire occurs, or they happen simultaneously. Migrant farm workers, in particular in California, endure exposure to intense heat combined with physical labor that can be deadly. Numerous migrant worker deaths occur each year due to such conditions. The CDC reports that heat deaths among farm workers are 20 times greater than among U.S. civilian workers, even when farms are in compliance with heat-related safety regulations. Moreover, research has shown that from the years 2005 to 2015, 198 non-U.S. citizen deaths occurred on farms, which is over triple that of the U.S. citizens. Further, many of these deaths and illnesses may not be accounted due to the linguistic or cultural barriers, immigration status, and other factors. Moreover, farm workers may be more vulnerable to extreme heat illness due to existing health and social disparities. This vulnerability will be heightened due to a warming climate and growing demand for food. And this labor will largely occur during the harvest months, which can coincide and compound with the most extreme weather events and disasters, again, such as wildfires. You know, through the various years of research since 2017, I have been documenting these extreme climatic events or climate-induced disasters such as wildfires with labor rights, migrant rights, and environmental justice groups in Northern California and in the Central Coast, and increasingly throughout the state. I recently served as an academic advisor to the first in nation Undocu Summit. It brought 23 organizations that provide mutual aid and specifically cash assistance and disaster aid to undocumented migrants. So this is the first summit of this kind of NGOs that have been providing that relief to undocumented migrants. And we had an amazing time sharing stories, but more importantly, strategizing and developing advocacy plans for more equitable disaster outcomes in California and the nation. And, you know, I just want to put this extreme heat a little bit more into context. because extreme weather events, existing health care disparities alone do not cause death or illness. It is systemic and stems from discrimination, historic disinvestment in communities of color, and labor exploitation, among other factors. To put these environmental inequities and the regional wealth gap into context, I want to focus your attention to a local music festival here in California. You probably know it simply as Coachella, which brings celebrities, artists, and music enthusiasts together. The average attendee pays around $2,500 to attend. For comparison, the average annual income of a farm worker is less than $18,000. Housing affordability is a major issue, which leaves many migrant farm workers living in their cars and also sleeping in the parking lot floors during the summer months because it is too hot, often over 90 degrees even at midnight. Though rare, this Southern California region is also the only place in the United States where scientists have documented heat-related deaths during the winter months due to hot, gusty winds. In addition, residents in eastern Coachella Valley often live in dilapidated mobile home parks with no air conditioning and located on Native American lands. Undocumented migrants often endure unsafe environments because federal immigration agents cannot deport them on sovereign territory. These compounding of environmental disasters and inequities is a new line of research I hope to further examine and work closely with community groups on policy responses and action. But the heat impacts to Latino and Indigenous migrant communities are not restricted only to agricultural settings. For example, this past summer, Esteban Chavez, a junior who was 24 and a delivery driver for UPS, died while delivering packages after he reportedly collapsed inside the truck while in a customer's driveway. The family says he was unconscious for over 20 minutes before someone finally discovered him. An investigative article published by NBC in 2019 noted at least 107 UPS workers in 23 states have been hospitalized for heat illnesses since 2015. The only company to report more heat-related incidents in the United States is the U.S. Postal Service, which also does not have air conditioning in its trucks. The recent reports by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change cited a growing body of research about the impact of human-induced climate change and its role in intensifying weather extremes such as heat waves. The report detailed how greenhouse gas emissions are affecting increasingly hotter temperatures, how this warmer climate is expected to increase surface ozone over polluted regions, which is some of the precursors of smog, and how some aspects such as heat may be amplified in cities because urban areas are typically warmer than surrounding regions. This is also known as the urban heat island effect. These heat islands form because urban surfaces such as roadways and rooftops absorb and emit heat to greater extent than most natural surfaces. Therefore, these heat impacts are important to Latino communities, many of which of them reside in urban areas and are part of a population that are socially vulnerable. And this brings me to some of the new research that I'm pursuing with community-based organizations, in particular education and social justice groups such as Alliance for a Better Community. Here, we're really arguing that the push for greener schools, how community groups are fighting extreme heat, and advocating and arguing that poor communities of color are disproportionately affected by heat, and experts say schools reflect broader injustices. Here, we have engaged in a community engaged research project with parent leaders. These are largely Latino immigrant parent leaders in Northeast Los Angeles, the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. These are parent leaders that are active around educational advocacy and partly on health as well, but they are very separated from the mainstream environmental justice agenda or the mainstream environmental agenda. So here we're creating an education and a research collaboration that teaches and jointly teaches the community parent leaders about the climate impacts happening on their local communities. Here we have, this is a news report we did with ABC Local News, where we provided parent leaders with thermal heat guns to register heat temperatures on school grounds, particularly school grounds that do not have a lot of greening in low-income communities of color. And at this particular day, the thermal heat infrared gun registered 160 degrees at 12 p.m. During a recent heat wave. And this was on a playground. So 168 degrees on a really rubber plastic surface of the playground. Here we're really trying to empower community parents and community members through community science methods. And this school here, Adama Elementary School, had an 8% green space. That means that 92% of this school has hardscape, non-permeable green space with little bit of vegetation and trees. And this 8% is actually pretty good compared to other low-income communities of color throughout the Los Angeles Unified School District, unfortunately. And then now I want to talk a little bit more about the wildfire research that I've been doing with community groups, migrant groups. When people are planning for social vulnerability, they often render Latino and Indigenous migrant communities invisible because public policy excludes them and traditional research can exploit them. My research on climate-induced disasters focuses on disparate impacts of extreme wildfire events. This research has shown that undocumented migrants in California have suffered from a dangerous combination of extreme heat and smoke. Moreover, migrant rights and environmental justice groups that lived and worked during these wildfire disasters are my co-authors of this research. They have been vital contributors for the research design, data collection, and analysis. They were also influential in presenting key policy findings to multiple audiences at the local, state, national, and international levels, including the United Nations Migration Agency, NOAA, and CalOES, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. So through this co-productionist framework, undocumented migrants are showing how they are rendered invisible in the context of public policy by systemic racism and cultural norms regarding U.S. citizenship and who's considered a worthy disaster victim. Moreover, our research highlights how political choices are being made that prioritize some lives over others. And in particular, we highlight that the lack of occupational health and safety standards is a key concern as intensifying wildfires collide with harvest season each year. We're engaging in readings of local purple air monitoring and highlighting where farm workers were deployed to harvest crops during recent fires. Undocumented farm workers, unfortunately, are shouldering the burden of protecting Sonoma's wine grapes, in this case, from smoke and ash. Fine particulate matter, such as PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke, which is this toxic mix of heavy metals and other chemicals from burning structures and objects, can be several times more harmful to human respiratory health than PM 2.5 from other sources, such as car exhaust. Since 2015 in Northern California, the annual mean PM 2.5 has increased as a result of extreme wildfire events, and these events have taken over as the main source of PM 2.5 exceedances. The harm that wildfire smoke causes to farm workers may be greater than previously thought, bolstering the argument for additional research and policies to safeguard the most vulnerable and stigmatized populations. And I just want to highlight two quotes from our research in the field with undocumented individuals. And this quote here first reads, "We all got sick. Our throats closed in from breathing too much smoke, and our kids couldn't go to school. We had to buy masks and medicine for our throats and some goggles because my eyes were irritated when I work." Other farmers told us that they worked for days and hours and sometimes even weeks in these extreme wildfire events, and they would come home and literally have black saliva. Another outdoor worker, a landscaper in this situation told us, I could not get to the homes where I worked because the streets were closed. 2 of the homes I worked at were destroyed. One of my good friends was lost during the disaster. He had only been living in the area for 3 weeks before he died. I myself am a cancer survivor. I'm the only one who provides for the family. So this quote here really underscores that these migrant farm workers have existing health disparities, respiratory diseases, in this case, also cancer. And when wildfire smoke, that toxic smoke comes and they're inhaling it, it creates, again, what the public health field calls a syndemic, because disaster colliding with existing health disparities, a syndemic. So, the last couple of slides, I just really want to conclude with this idea that for a policy implication, existing disasters are only existing inequalities are only exacerbated during disaster, primarily because there's no social safety net to protect these individuals before disaster. And political choices have been made to intentionally withhold some of these vital planning resources and mutual aid and recovery from these individuals. So if you really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants. And another key insight from our research is thinking beyond just property values and really understanding that there's this cascading impact that happens to the region. Well, some of these individuals, their homes may not have been destroyed in the fire. Some have, but some live outside in an immediate fire risk zone, that there's cascading health effects that affects people's health and also affects their economic well-being, because the economy infrastructure is shut down throughout the entire region, that affects people's livelihood and health. And then finally, this idea of having more diverse leadership in disaster management and also in our climate change science and policy practice. Here's a Scientific American article where a senior disaster manager told an oversight committee of Congress that overwhelmingly that the disaster management field, senior management was primarily white and male. And here it really underscores that our disaster field is not representative of those individuals that are at the front lines of disaster, let alone climate-induced disasters. So we need to have more cultural, linguistic, and contextual competency and diversify our disaster management. And this includes having more inclusive disaster planning, legitimizing migrant indigenous community knowledge and lived experience throughout the planning process, including into scientific processes, embracing migrant communities in disaster planning, responsive recovery, and bolstering Latinx and indigenous civil society organizations' capacity in disaster relief and planning efforts. And just a quick note on some of the funding for this research: National Science Foundation, National Center for Atmospheric Research, and then the Andrew Carnegie Foundation. So that's in a nutshell, sort of a big picture overview of the research I've been doing on migrants in California in terms of the heat and wildfires.